Emma Mijas died a horrible and painful death unnecessarily on her very first Christmas Eve 2004 at the hands of 25 doctors and nurses, another victim of medical malpractice. All 25 doctors and nurses systematically administered the wrong drugs for her life-threatening condition called SLOS. SLOS, Smith-Lemli-Optis syndrome, is a congenital abnormality which requires treatment strategies on supplying supplemental cholesterol. They gave Emma the wrong drug, Questran, not once, but 92 times. Yes, 92 times in 1 month. A cholesterol-reducing drug, not the cholesterol supplemental drug she needed. All of them knew better. They were trained to know better. They were some of the world's leading authorities at the Louisiana State University Health Science Center in New Orleans. But they just didn't give a damn about Emma's life. In 2013, the prestigious Journal of Patient Safety published a study that as many as 440,000 patients die each year from preventable medical errors. That would make medical errors the third leading cause of death in America, behind heart disease and cancer, which is second. These people are not dying from the illnesses that caused them to seek hospital care in the first place. No, they are dying from mistakes that hospitals could have prevented. What are these fatal errors? Who are these incompetent and negligent doctors? A New England Journal of Medicine, January 28, 2016 study reported that 1% of physicians accounted for 32% of paid malpractice claims over the last 10 years. The ugly truth is that little is being done to hold these dangerous doctors accountable. Researchers found that bad doctors showed distinctive characteristics, including having paid previous malpractice claims. So it stands to reason that healthcare providers could eliminate 1/3 of medical malpractice along with patients' pain and suffering, as well as the added cost of corrective surgeries, long-term care, and indemnity payments by removing the worst 1% of doctors. Why aren't bad doctors stopped from practicing? The answer lies, at least partially, in the National Practitioner Data Bank, a clearinghouse for information on medical malpractice that Congress established in 1986 to help state licensing boards police the healthcare industry. The national database was supposed to help states identify dangerous doctors and prevent them from harming more patients, and is used by hospitals, insurers, and licensing boards to track doctors' records, check prospective hires, and make other decisions. But it is virtually useless in holding doctors accountable because, by federal law, none are listed by name. They are assigned a random number to protect their identities. Even if doctors were identified in the data as they should be, the public would still be barred by law from accessing the records. So vulnerable, sick patients sit in the waiting rooms of bad physicians without a clue about their poor record of performance. And in many cases, a negligent doctor's insurance company pays the victim of malpractice and the doctor goes back to work. If a doctor develops a bad enough reputation in one town, he can move to a new state and continue practicing. This is unbelievable. But today, the public does not have access to the database to identify doctors' names and addresses, to identify doctors with uniquely long histories of being sued or disciplined for medical malpractice. Because on September 1st, 2011, the government cut off public access. What was behind that decision? Apparently, one Kansas doctor with a trail of malpractice suits, Dr. Robert Tenny. The Kansas-based doctor complained to the Government Health Resources and Service Administration that the Kansas City Star newspaper was publishing the story of one of his patients, Maribeth Chase, who died in 2007 after undergoing a brain surgery with Dr. Tenny. It is also noted that Tenny has been sued at least 16 times for medical malpractice, but had never been disciplined by the state's licensing boards. The Insider Exclusive produced a TV story on this case with the lawyers who represented Marybeth's family when doctors go bad, Maribeth Chase versus Dr. Robert T. Tenny. Tenny finally settled the Chase family's wrongful death suit for $1 million. The settlement brought total malpractice payments paid on Tenny's behalf since the early 1990s to roughly $3.7 million. In some states, including California, Colorado, Georgia, and New York, patients can go to medical boards' websites to find out about doctors' malpractice histories, but not in Kansas and Missouri. Why don't doctors report on bad doctors? Physicians often see the mistakes made by their peers, which puts them in a sticky ethical situation. Should they tell the patient about a mistake made by a different doctor? Too often they don't. Why not? One reason is that doctors depend on each other for business. So a physician who breaks the code of silence may become known as an informer or snitch and lose referrals, a financial penalty. Doctors also may be wary of becoming entangled in a medical malpractice case or causing a colleague to face legal consequences. The bottom line, too often doctors aren't learning from errors, nor are patients getting the information they need to receive proper treatment or compensation when the outcome is harmful.
In this Insider Exclusive Network TV special, Justice in America, Randy Powell's story, we visit with Benjamin Scott, partner at Barnett, Bennett & Scott, LLP, Randy Powell's mother, Shirley Powell, as we take you inside today's legal system, examining Ben's strategies and his clients' thoughts, and in vivid detail showing you the often heartbreaking stories of cases like his client, Randy Powell, who Ben is fighting for justice in this featured medical malpractice case against Dr. Joel Kahn. These victims could be you or me one day, and if you are so unlucky, you will quickly find out that justice in America is a hard-won battle where very few insurance companies, doctors, nurses, and hospitals ever do the right thing. And you need experienced and passionate trial lawyers like Benjamin Scott, partner at Barnett, Bennett & Scott, who wage these battles with their own financial resources to get justice for their clients. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Fairfield, California. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ben Scott to the show. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, I haven't been here in many years, and I'm glad you invited us.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here as well. I'm glad we can talk a little bit today and share about the case we have.
Yeah, tell our audience first a little bit about your law firm. What type of law does your firm practice?
So our law firm practices personal injury law. So what we focus on are those people who've been injured because somebody else broke a safety rule, those rules that are there to keep us all safe. A lot of cases we handle involve car crashes where we have drivers who are distracted or who aren't following the rules of the road and they hurt somebody. Yeah. And we also handle a few medical malpractice cases. These are cases where a doctor chooses not to follow those patient safety rules that are designed to protect all patients. When that happens and somebody is injured because of it, those people need representation. They need help to make it through and help to get the compensation they deserve. And so we see our firm as reaching out and helping those people who've been harmed.
You know, when you're a little bit of an unusual lawyer in the sense that you came from another profession, and that same profession had the same underlying theme, that is, you were a teacher before, right? And you wanted to help people to teach them, but you saw you could do much more as a lawyer.
Absolutely. I love teaching. I taught high school chemistry and physics at West Ranch High School down in the LA area. And I love my students, love being able to teach, and what I love most about teaching is seeing the growth in those students and where they're becoming who they're going to be for the rest of their lives, and just the eagerness they have, and I love being a part of that, and I love being able to help them, and that's one of the reasons why I'm driven to helping people in personal injury as well, is because I still get to help people when they need it the most.
I know another teacher turned lawyer, Gloria Allred, and everybody knows what she has done in the legal field. But today we are here because you are representing a client, Randy Powell, who is a victim of a medical malpractice case. Would you tell our audience a little bit about who Randy is?
Now, unfortunately, I didn't get to know Randy Powell before his accident, know the person that he was before. I know the stories from his family. I met his family and talked with them about the stories, and from what I've learned about him, I love the guy. He's just know him as a happy and helpful son. You know, he was there with his parents. His dad had suffered a stroke, and he had moved back in with his parents to be able to take care of his dad. He was engaged to be married when his accident happened, and he was known in his family as the chef. Every time their family would have these big get-togethers, they would have family reunions of over 100 family members there, and he'd be the one manning the barbecue, and he loved it. He wouldn't give up that job.
Show up for the cooking of the food, right?
He'd show up for the cooking of the food, and now he wasn't perfect either.
Yeah.
You know, he had a lot of health issues. So he was obese. He
Right.
was 320 pounds or so. He also had a problem called sleep apnea. You know, as when you fall asleep, then the airway starts to close up, and in fact, his sleep apnea was so bad that he had to get a tube placed in his neck called a tracheostomy tube, and this was to help him breathe. Randy Powell, one morning back in 2012, he had this metal tube in his neck, and he had to clean it out. And he was using a brush to clean out his tube. And
one that's prescribed medically.
yeah, and it's the brush he used all the time to clean it out. And this brush had broken off, and so a piece of this brush had fallen in through the tube and down his throat, and was stuck in the top of his lung. And so Randy calls the hospital, and he's in no immediate distress. He's breathing fine. He ends up driving himself to the hospital. He gets there, and the ER doctor sees him, looks at his chart and sees about him, sees that he has a tracheostomy tube in his neck. So this ER doctor, Dr. Joel Kahn is the name of this ER doctor. He calls the treating physician at UCSF. Treating physician tells him to call in a pulmonologist. Now, a pulmonologist is a doctor who deals with the lungs, and this pulmonologist can then try to remove the brush by sticking what's called a bronchoscope down through this tube in the neck, and then grasping onto it with some alligator clips and pulling it back up. So the pulmonologist takes Randy Powell away, comes back to Dr. Kahn a little while later and says that he wasn't able to do it. This pulmonologist calls Dr. Kahn and tells him, I couldn't get the brush out. The brush keeps getting caught on this tracheostomy tube. Dr. Kahn then decides to do what's called an intubation, where they can try to pull out this brush another way. Now, a rapid sequence intubation, the long and short of it is when a doctor needs to make sure that a patient has an airway, that the patient can get oxygen. They can take a plastic tube, put it into the mouth, down through the trachea, and then into the lungs. Then this tube can be attached to a breathing apparatus to make sure that the patient has an open airway that can get oxygen. And one of the problems with this is that Randy Powell was not going to be a routine intubation. Because of his obesity, because of his sleep apnea, this is a patient who's, when he lays down, when he falls asleep, his airway is going to close up. You also have, when you have an obese individual, what happens is they don't have the oxygen reserves that a lot of other people don't. That's why a lot of times they'll get winded climbing up the stairs. They don't have this level of oxygen that can sustain them for a time when they're not receiving oxygen. And these are all complications that any ER doctor should know about. Should know that this is not going to be a routine intubation. And then to make matters worse, this is a procedure that is totally elective and totally unnecessary at the time. This is an emergency room doctor often has to work under emergency situations where they don't have time sometimes to call on a specialist. This is a case where he does. Because of all of these complications, this is a procedure that needs to be handled by an anesthesiologist. Anesthesiologists are the experts at intubation. ER doctors can do them, and they do them frequently. But when it comes to a patient like this in an elective situation, it needs to be in a controlled environment. And Now Dr. Khan decides to do it, and the worst thing about it is he does it without forming a plan. In this intubation, a doctor has to administer a paralyzing drug. And what this paralyzing drug, it allows the doctor to be able to grab the jaw, move the jaw where it needs to go, to be able to get that tube down the throat and into the airway. And so the patient needs to be completely paralyzed. And one thing that paralytic agent does, it knocks out the breathing. So here you have an obese patient whose breathing is going to get knocked out. He can't breathe on his own. His airway's closing up. That's the whole reason why he has this tube in his neck. And this doctor doesn't have a plan for how he's going to get oxygen to this patient in case something goes wrong. He knows this is a complicated patient. He knows that there's a very high likelihood that something's going to go wrong. And he chooses to plow forward without having a way out.
Why do you think he did that? Why do you think he made that decision?
Well, I can't go into the mind of Dr. Khan and know exactly what he's thinking. It could be that he's overconfident, that he thinks, hey, I've done this before, I can do it again. Doesn't realize what he's getting into, doesn't realize all the complications that are there. It could be that he doesn't conceive that he might fail.
Yeah, from what you were saying about the paralytic drug, he did not know how much of a dosage he needed to give him, correct?
Oh, absolutely. He didn't even know the right drug to give. He didn't.
And because of that, what happened?
Well, two problems here. Number one, he gives the drug that's not the best drug for this situation.
So therefore?
So therefore, there's one drug, succinylcholine, that should have been used. This is a drug that is not as long-lasting. So if something goes wrong, the patient recovers more quickly. He uses a drug called rocuronium. It's a paralyzing drug. It can be used, but what happens is, if things go wrong, this drug lasts 30 to 40 minutes where the patient is going to be unable to breathe.
And that's 30 or 40 minutes without oxygen, because he can't breathe on his own.
Right, so if you don't get an airway, there's no oxygen, there's no way he can breathe on his own. But then, what he does, not knowing the right medication is one thing, because rocuronium, it can work. You can intubate with that. It does paralyze. May not be the best choice, but it's possible. But what makes matters worse, again, is that he doesn't even know the right dose. He believes that the right dose for an individual of Randy Powell's size is 10 milligrams. The right dose is really 100 milligrams or more. And it's one that all of the expert doctors, the ER doctors who use these medications routinely, they know that there's not really a danger of an overdose here. If you give too much, it's not going to paralyze them more. The danger is an underdosing with this drug and not giving enough. And here, Dr. Khan, not even knowing the right doses, gives a dose that is 10 times too little. So basically what he does, it knocks him out enough to stop the breathing, but it makes it so those ideal conditions for intubating aren't there, where he's not able to get that tube down where it needs to be. He tries this intubation, and when he first tries, we can tell Randy Powell's not paralyzed like he's supposed to be, because he becomes combative. He starts moving his arms around, starts trying to pull out his IV. And those aren't the actions of somebody who's been properly paralyzed. And the wrong drug dose is one thing, but again, the bigger problem goes back to this failure to plan. You always have to know as a doctor that you can't leave a patient without oxygen. We need that to live. And this doctor didn't have a plan to get Randy Powell oxygen. So this whole time where he's unable to intubate, he tries several times. It becomes a very traumatic intubation where there's lots of blood that has to be suctioned out of the mouth because of this trauma. And as he's trying, nothing's done during this whole time. Randy Powell ends up suffering a permanent brain injury. He's now in what's called a persistent vegetative state. He's in a care facility right now where they care for him, and he's not on life support per se. He's on a feeding tube, but he is able to breathe on his own now, and there is some movement. It's hard to say whether it's voluntary movement or not. He turns his head, his eyes blink, his mouth is moving, as you can see in the video.
You can't communicate with him.
It's not known whether or not what he's understanding, and
he can't communicate with the rest of the world.
Right. We don't know what Randy Powell is thinking. We don't know what he's suffering through now.
Okay, now Tell our audience a little bit about what has transpired. Obviously, his family hired an attorney in the beginning, and there was a trial, but it was a mistrial, correct?
We've actually had 2 mistrials in this case. So we are going to trial for the 3rd time on this case, and it's a credit to the family for all they've gone through, that not giving up on Randy. And so the first time we had.
And he's suing for medical malpractice.
It is for medical malpractice.
Okay.
And the first time there was a mistrial, it was an evidentiary issue where the judge felt that some of the evidence that came in was too prejudicial to one side, and so he declared a mistrial for that.
And from my understanding, it was a doctor that spoke more than what his report was all about, right?
There was another doctor. This is the pulmonologist who was there. He when he was asked about it before, he talked about Randy Powell becoming combative. Yeah. And then in trial, when asked about it, he also mentioned that Randy Powell, when he became combative, part of that combativeness was that he actually sat up when he tried to pull out those IVs. And the judge felt that new fact that came out was a surprise to the other side, and it wasn't fair to have it play out without giving them an opportunity to prepare for it.
And the second trial was a mistrial too, correct?
And the second trial was a mistrial. This one went all the way to a jury, and the jury was trying to come to a decision, and they had what's called a hung jury, where they couldn't decide, and they were deadlocked, and the judge determined that there was no way for them to come to an agreement.
Yeah, now the doctor's defense, his lawyer's defense, has been, from what I understand, that he had the absolute, correct me if I'm wrong, absolute discretion to do whatever he wanted to do under the circumstances because he's an emergency doctor. Is that right?
That's partly right. What they said is...
And I'm addressing the wrong sedative and the wrong dosage.
Yeah, what they say is, it was just a doctor's judgment call. Yeah. That a doctor can just, based on his experience, that he can decide whatever he wants. And for a jury, sometimes that is hard to get past, because a lot of times the jury doesn't understand all of the medicine, and we want to be able to trust our doctors. I want to be able to go to the doctor and know that doctor is going to make the right judgment. And so that was one of the defenses, and the other defense is trying to shift all of the blame onto the other doctor who was there, the pulmonologist who was there as well.
Is he being sued?
He's not being sued.
Well, the fact is, if he's not being sued, obviously the client doesn't think he's at fault, right?
And yeah, and that's part of that's
pretty big. That's a pretty big obvious fact, right?
But what happens anytime that somebody is sued? Of course, they have a right to a defense, and they're going to make whatever defense they can to save themselves.
Now you're going to trial again in September, I think.
In August.
In August. What's your biggest challenge here?
So my biggest challenge, personal challenge for me anytime we go to trial is lack of sleep. Yeah. But the biggest challenge we have in any medical malpractice case is it's often very hard for people to hold the doctor accountable. It's
because they want to believe the guy in the white coat.
Absolutely. I want to believe in my doctors. I want to believe that my doctors are following the rules and they're doing what's safe. Yeah. And it's sometimes very hard. And so in order for us to convince a jury that the doctor did something wrong, it's not just that we have to prove what the legal standard calls more likely than not. They often require a lot more of us to prove that if they're going to punish a doctor and hold the doctor accountable, they need a lot more. So that's a big challenge we have in a medical malpractice.
And experts say, yes, he didn't meet the reasonable standard of care. And yet the other side has experts that will directly contradict that, right?
Right.
So then it becomes up to the jury to decide who's telling the truth.
Yeah, and that's one of the hard things for jurors to decide is when you have 2 well-qualified experts that are disagreeing, a lot of times the jury is just going to decide, well, I'm not sure, so they'll just cancel each other out. Yeah. And so really just having one expert is not enough. It has to, the jury really has to be convinced in a case like this.
We today have with us Randy's mom, Shirley Powell, and we're going to bring her on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Shirley Powell to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming here.
My pleasure.
Very tragic what has happened to your son, Randy.
Yes, it is.
Take us back to the time when you remember you probably got a phone call, right?
Yes, I did. It was one morning early, like maybe 6 a.m. I got a call from my son, who I thought was in the house. And he was calling me to tell me that, Mom, I'm in the hospital. And I said, why? I mean, I just saw you not long ago, last night. What happened? And he said he was cleaning his trach. He had a trach in his throat. He was cleaning it, and the brush that was medically prescribed broke, and he was at the hospital. He didn't know what had happened, so he drove himself to Sutter Hospital. He didn't wake me up, but he called me to let me know that he was okay, and he thought they could get the trach out.
Let me ask you this, Ben. Had he not attempted to try to remove this bristle, I guess it was, right, that fell off the brush and got stuck in his tube, what would have happened to that?
Well, it would have had to come out sometime. It would have had to come out eventually. It was causing some irritation in the lung. And
Is it made of like metal or what? Or is it like a plastic or something?
so you can think of it as a metal, kind of like a barbecue brush, but at a much smaller scale. So it's a metal brush there to clean out the metal tube.
So your son, Randy, called and he said he was there and...
Right, and he was in a good mood, and he said, Mom, I drove really fast getting here. So they're going to work on me, and I'll call and let you know what's going on. So I immediately called my daughter and said that, told her what had happened. She lived in Sacramento, and I told her I was on my way there, but I had a luncheon that I was supposed to go to. So she said, no, Mom, he sounds okay. I'll come from Sacramento and I'll be with him. And they take it on, which she did. And when she arrived, he was happy, talking, and they assured them that it would be easy getting out.
The doctors.
The doctors. Yeah. And he would be okay. So she called me and told me, so I went to the luncheon and I felt really good, you know. It was, with another daughter and I were together, and we were having a good time until they called us to get to the hospital right away.
How soon after? Was this a couple hours after lunch?
A couple hours. That was when I left home. It was about 10, and that was like 1:30.
Okay, so when they say get to the hospital right away, what did she
There
say?
had been complications, Mom, and things don't look good. Get here as soon as you can, and which I did.
What were your thoughts?
Fairfield at the time, and I thought, what could have gone on? I mean, I was with him when they put the trach in, and you know, I've been with him through a lot of hospital visits, and everything was fine.
So when you got to the hospital, somebody explained.
Explained to
Who explained? Was it Dr. Joel Kahn?
Dr. Lou.
Another doctor?
Yes.
He was a pulmonologist?
He was, that's correct.
But he's not involved with this lawsuit?
So he's not been sued.
Okay, fine.
And he was going through convulsions. His body was just jumping, like it was jumping off the table. He was just in a state, he didn't know we were there, but he was just, body was moving and jumping. I couldn't stand to watch it. And so my daughter was tearfully telling me what happened. Everything was fine. She went to the bathroom, and she came out. She saw the feet around the bed, and she was wondering what was going on, and somebody was saying code blue, and she just...
So you were there when the code blue happened?
No, I wasn't. My daughter was there. Yeah. When I arrived, he was going through convulsions. His body was just jumping off the table, and they were trying to get a trauma unit at one of the other hospitals to take him to.
Yeah, but as we spoke earlier, there's no record of the code blue at the hospital. The record.
Yeah, we don't know what happened to those
Code
records.
blue happened, no records, right?
Correct.
Very suspicious. Okay, then they brought him to another hospital?
Well, no, he stayed there all day from, we arrived at 1, so we called other family members there. We all joined hands and prayed, and they were trying desperately to get somebody else to take him to see what they can do to get the brush out. And that didn't happen until 7 that evening. The hospital, John Muir in Concord, they decided to take him to a trauma facility. And that was at about 7 that night. He got there about 9.
And since that time, you have never spoken to him again?
No. Mm-mm.
Or he has never communicated with you?
Never.
And how long ago was that?
That was October 27, 2012. It's been almost 7 years.
Wow.
And he has been in a vegetative state for the last
Yes, he
7 years.
has, more or less.
You are on national TV right now. Okay, what do you have to say to the hospital, to the doctor, Dr. Joel Kahn, who was the ER doctor responsible for everything that happened? What do you have to say to that?
As Dr. Khan, my family and I trust you. My son drove himself to the hospital. He wanted to live. And he went to your care. He called me and I told him I was sure everything would be okay, because I felt that he drove himself to a place for help. He thought maybe something might have been detrimental, and he went to your hands, your hospital, for help. And by a little accident, has caused him from like a 49-year-old man. That's it. His life is, has really been interrupted.
Drastically so.
Drastically. A good son who loved living, who loved dancing, happy, laughing all the time, always in a good mood. He'd be with his friends. He'd had friends from grammar school, high school, still the same friends. His girlfriend, his fiancée, Cynthia, they were always together, having a good time. He helped me with his dad, excellent uncle. Took care of his nephews. His sisters weren't around. He was always there with me to help when they were at work during the summer, and taking them to the park, picnics. Just a total loss.
Yeah, we're all very sorry to hear what has transpired here. This has been not only a medical battle, but it's also been a legal battle, because I understand you had another lawyer before and they retired, or
Right, retired, and then
Ben took over. And what do you think about the way Ben's been handling it?
excellent. Ben has a soft heart. He apparently he feels my pain, and he's done all he could to help. He's presented the case in an excellent manner.
We have another trial coming up here in September, or in August.
Yeah, in August, another trial in August.
I hope you get the result that you deserve.
Oh, I'm just praying so that, something could be done.
I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you.
Let me ask you something, Ben. There's a lot of people who feel that their doctor failed them, that he could have done better or she could have done better. And they start screaming medical malpractice, I was screwed, my family's at loss, etc. What is exactly medical malpractice in the eyes of the law?
Yeah, the standard I use to determine if a case is a worthy case or not is I will always take it to an expert. I will always take it to a medical expert to review the medical records and see what happened. And if a doctor comes back to me and says, what the heck was this doctor thinking? That's the type of case that is medical malpractice, not just because a doctor ended up with a bad result, but a doctor really had to do something wrong. A very simple rule that was violated. Just as in this case, we have a very simple rule of know the right medication and give it. Have a plan to give the patient oxygen. Those are simple rules that were broken.
Yeah, you remember the story, the movie, The Verdict with Paul Newman. Right. Okay, medical malpractice case, wrongful death case. If I had somebody related to me that died in a hospital and I was suspicious when a doctor came out and said, we did everything we could, but I'm an investigative reporter, so I had done some homework, let's say on the doctor or the hospital, whatever, and I knew that might not be true. Me personally, as a non-lawyer, what do you recommend victims of medical malpractice or family members of victims of medical malpractice do? What are some steps you recommend that they do before they come in and see a lawyer?
So every time a lawyer reviews a case, there's a couple things they need. Yeah. Number one, they need to have the medical records.
Okay, now is it impossible for a non-lawyer, regular citizen to get medical records? Because we've heard stories about hospitals lose them, can't find them, don't answer their phone calls. What do you have to say to that?
Well, it doesn't hurt to try. That's the you know, as a family member who has the right to get that. Of course, you have to make sure all of the privacy laws are followed, but a family member who has that right to get that can get those records from the hospital, and I want to trust that hospitals and doctors are doing the right thing and keeping those records, but we know there are cases where maybe they're not. Yeah. For example, in this case, we have there was a code blue called, but there are no code blue records in this case, and so we have no idea what happened to those records.
What do you think happened to them?
I'd be speculating. I know Dr. Khan's lawyer has told us that Dr. Khan viewed them at one point, and now Dr. Khan is claiming that he never saw them.
So we have the lawyer and the client in contradiction to each other.
So I don't know what happened to those records, and we may never know.
Can you report what you think as an individual? Can you report to the Medical Review Board in California, we're in California, a suspicious activity without the facts? Just say, I think that, you know, this happened.
Yeah, everything needs to be based on evidence, and just accusing somebody without evidence is not.
What you just said a minute ago, the lawyer said the doctor reviewed the code blue charts, but the doctor says the lawyer is actually either mistaken or lying. One of the two, okay? There only could be two possibilities. Is that suspicious activity where you, as a lawyer, let's say after this case, you report it to the Medical Review Board?
And it could be, and you know, there's lots of things that play out, and obviously I want to make sure if I am going to report something, I don't want to report it unless there is convincing evidence of it.
Okay. Now, this is a case in the state of California here, and a lot of states, that is subject to what we call caps. And caps, you can explain caps better than I can to our audience.
Right. A cap is basically a limit on what somebody can recover in a lawsuit.
And in this lawsuit, or in any lawsuit, there's two types of damages. One, a non-economic loss damages, and an economic loss. Non-economic means pain and suffering, right? And economic means you can't work, you can't do that job anymore, whatever you would have made, you're not going to make, that's economic loss. Right. In the state of California, we have an unusually harsh law called MICRA, correct?
Correct, yes.
And explain that to us.
So MICRA stands for Medical Injury Compensation Reform Act, passed in 1975. Yes. And in 1975, they decided that this cap on non-economic damages, the pain and suffering, inconvenience, loss of enjoyment of life, are all those legal terms we talk about. But really what it is, it's damage to the person. And I think those non-economic damages are always so much more than an economic loss. If you think of a family who's lost a loved one, they don't sit around the table talking about, boy, I sure miss this paycheck that we used to get. Yeah. They sit around the table talking about, boy, we sure miss our son. Yeah. We sure miss our dad, our mom, whoever it is they've lost. And that damage to the person is always so much more than those economic losses.
But in the state of California, it's limited to $250,000 and has been for almost 40 years. Correct. Okay, so in cases like Randy Powell's, you know, you have two potential damages that could happen. Non-economic is limited to $250,000, and economic is whatever the economic loss is. And if a person is unemployed, if they don't have an income, if they're retired, that kind of stuff, there isn't any money that can be awarded that victim.
Yeah, it's terribly unjust.
So the result is, and this is why we do these shows, is that many lawyers, and thank God you took this case, won't take a case because they're going to be working for free even if they win.
Yeah, in a case like this, we talked about this need for experts. Often you're going to have several experts, witnesses on a case, and they charge a lot of money. And sometimes
ours $25,000 to $50,000 a piece.
Oh, and sometimes more.
Yeah.
This is a case, you can imagine going to trial 3 times on this case. The costs have gotten really high. And a lot of times when lawyers look at taking a case, if they see that the most they can get out of a case is $250,000, and they're going to have to spend over $100,000 to get there, the economics don't make sense for them. And then what happens is, even if somebody wins their case, there's not going to be as much left for them because all of that money has had to go to paying for those expert witnesses. Right. And so it becomes very difficult for good lawyers. We'll look at a case and
to stay in business.
Yeah, if all they take are these cases, it's hard to stay in business.
When someone comes to your office, and whether it's a medical malpractice case or not, what is the criteria you use to determine whether you want to represent this person?
What I look at is I see, was this something that was totally preventable? Was this something that is going to harm more people in the future? Because sometimes if I see that even though there may not be as much money in the case, but it's going to be something that protects our community, that makes us all safe. For example, in a medical malpractice case, I want to make sure that when I go to the hospital, when I go and see a doctor, when my family goes to the doctor, I want to make sure that I have doctors there who are following the rules. And I don't want bad doctors to give good doctors a bad name, because there are lots of wonderful and amazing doctors out there who are helping all of us.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show, and good luck with your trial.
All right. Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.